My people, imagine this. Early morning in the village of Atani, and Dorcas is walking down the dusty road like a queen returning from battle, her head high and a huge basket of bright red tatashe peppers sitting proudly on her head. The peppers are so fresh and shiny that even the sun looks jealous. As she walks, villagers stop what they are doing to greet her. "Dorcas, save pepper for me," one woman shouts. Children run behind her yelling, "Auntie Dorcas! Auntie Dorcas!" Even the men who once laughed at her now stand straight like soldiers when she passes. Then she reaches the market, lowers her big basket onto the wooden table, and suddenly, boom! Customers rush from every corner shouting, "Sell to me first! Dorcas, give me the biggest one!" People are pushing baskets, waving money, and stretching their hands like they are chasing treasure. But my people, what if I tell you that the secret behind Dorcas's pepper is something that will shock you, confuse you, and maybe even make you look at your own kitchen pepper twice? Stay with me, because this story of Dorcas and her red fire pepper is not as simple as it looks. Welcome to AfroTales TV, your home for rich, exciting, and inspiring stories from around the world. Today's story will touch your heart and keep you hooked to the very end. If you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our amazing stories. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet riverside village of Atani. The sky was pale orange and the early air carried the soft smell of wet soil, firewood smoke, and fresh leaves. Chickens were already scratching the ground around the compounds, and goats walked lazily along the sandy paths, chewing whatever they could find. Women were sweeping their yards with long brooms made from dry palm fronds, pushing the dust into small piles. The soft sound of sweeping, the crowing of roosters, and the distant laughter of children filled the peaceful morning. But this morning was not like every other morning. Something exciting was about to happen. From the far edge of the village road, a tall basket slowly appeared above the heads of the tall grass. Then the person carrying it stepped onto the open dusty path. It was Dorcas. Dorcas walked slowly and proudly, balancing a very big basket on her head. The basket was so full that it looked heavy, but Dorcas carried it with ease, as if it weighed nothing at all. Inside the basket were the biggest red tatashe peppers anyone in the village had ever seen. They were smooth, large, and shining bright red in the sunlight. The peppers looked so fresh that they almost glowed. Dorcas herself was a woman in her 40s. Her skin was very dark and smooth, the color of deep palm oil. Her body was average and slightly chubby, giving her a strong and full appearance. Her short afro hair stood neatly on her head like a soft crown. Her face was not the kind people in the village usually called beautiful. Many years ago, people used to laugh at her looks. Some women even whispered that Dorcas was too plain and too dark. But things had changed. Very different. As Dorcas continued walking along the village road, her head high and her back straight, people stopped what they were doing to look at her. "Aha, Dorcas is going to the market," one old man said quietly. A group of small children playing with a homemade ball made from tight cloth suddenly stopped their game. "Auntie Dorcas!" one of them shouted happily. "Auntie Dorcas, is that the red fire pepper again?" another child yelled. Dorcas smiled gently. "Yes, little ones," she said, calmly. "Fresh pepper, the best pepper in the village." The children ran behind her like excited chicks following their mother. "Can we see them? Can we see them?" one boy begged. Dorcas slowly bent her head a little so the basket tilted slightly. The children gasped loudly. "Ah, they are so big! They are red like fire!" One little girl named Ada clapped her hands in excitement. "Auntie Dorcas, my mother will buy from you today. Yesterday she said your pepper made the soup smell so sweet." Dorcas chuckled softly. "Tell your mother to come early before everything finishes." The children laughed and continued following her as she walked proudly down the road. Across the street, two women sweeping their compound stopped and leaned on their brooms. One of them was a tall woman named Ngozi. The other was a thin woman named Ifeoma. Both of them stared at Dorcas quietly as she passed. Ngozi shook her head slowly. "Look at her walking like a queen," she said. Ifeoma sighed. It is that pepper," she replied. Ngozi frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ifeoma leaned closer. "I mean that pepper changed everything. Before she started selling that pepper, Nobody even looked at Dorcas. Ngozi nodded slowly. That is true. Years ago, Dorcas used to walk through the village quietly, with nobody paying attention to her. Some people even laughed when she passed. They called her plain. They said she would never marry. Some women whispered that Dorcas was too serious and too quiet. Things had changed. Very different. As Dorcas continued walking, a group of young men sitting under a mango tree saw her coming. One of them, a fisherman named Okete, quickly stood up. "Dorcas!" he called loudly. Dorcas stopped and looked at him. "Good morning, Okeke," she said politely. Okeke walked towards her with a big smile. "Ah, Dorcas, those peppers are already shining from far away." Dorcas laughed lightly. "Fresh from my basket," she said. Another young man named Emeka joined them. "Dorcas, save some for me today, oh. My mother wants to cook soup this evening." Dorcas nodded. "If you come early to the market, you will find them." Okeke scratched his head and spoke again. "You should let me carry the basket for you." Dorcas raised an eyebrow. "You want to carry my basket?" Okeke nodded quickly. "Yes, it looks heavy." Dorcas smiled. "Okeke, I have been carrying this basket for years. My neck is stronger than you think." The young men laughed. Emeka shook his head playfully. "Dorcas does not need help from anybody." Dorcas adjusted the basket slightly on her head. "Well, I must go now. The market will soon be busy." She continued walking. The young men watched her go. Emeka sighed loudly. "Ah, that woman has something special." Okeke nodded slowly. "Yes." Under another tree nearby, 3 young women sat together peeling cassava. Their names were Adaeze, Amaka, and Inkem. They had also been watching Dorcas. Amaka rolled her eyes. "See how those men are running after her," she muttered. Adaeze laughed dryly. "Running after Pepe, not her." Inkem shook her head. "But still, it is strange." Amaka frowned. "Very strange." She leaned forward and spoke quietly. Dorcas was never the kind of woman men chased before. Adaeze nodded. "That is true." Inkem looked at the road where Dorcas had disappeared. "But now, when she walks, everyone greets her." Amaka clicked her tongue. Meanwhile, Dorcas continued her journey down the dusty road toward the center of the village. The children slowly stopped following her when they reached their houses. Soon, Dorcas walked alone again. The morning sun had risen higher now, shining warmly on the roofs of the houses made from clay and zinc sheets. Dorcas walked with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what people expected from her. As she reached the main path leading to the market square, more villagers began greeting her. "Dorcas! Good morning, Dorcas! Save pepper for me today." Dorcas responded kindly to each greeting. "Yes, come early. There will be enough. Fresh pepper today." She did not hurry. She walked slowly like someone who knew the entire village was watching her. And in truth, many people were. Because when Dorcas arrived at the market, something interesting always happened. Her peppers never stayed long. They disappeared quickly into the cooking pots of the village. The sun had climbed higher into the sky when Dorcas finally reached the busy market square of Atani. The market was already alive with noise and movement. Women were spreading mats on the ground and arranging vegetables in neat piles. Men pushed wooden carts full of yams and cassava. The air was filled with many smells at the same time: fresh fish, dry pepper, roasted corn, and palm oil. Voices rose and fell everywhere as people greeted each other and called out the prices of their goods. In the middle of the market stood a simple wooden table that everyone in the village had begun to recognize. The table was not new. The wood was rough and slightly faded from years of sun and rain. But something about that table had become special. Everyone knew that when Dorcas arrived and placed her basket on it, something exciting would happen. Dorcas walked slowly into the market square with the large basket still balanced on her head. The red peppers inside the basket shone brightly under the morning sun, and people noticed them immediately. "Ah, Dorcas has arrived," someone shouted from across the market. Several heads turned at once. Dorcas smiled slightly, but kept walking calmly. She reached the wooden table and carefully lowered the basket onto it. She placed it down gently, making sure none of the peppers spilled. For a moment, the peppers sat quietly inside the basket like a pile of bright red treasure. Then everything changed. People began rushing toward her table from every direction. A woman carrying a baby on her back pushed through the crowd first. "Dorcas! Dorcas! Save some for me!" she cried. Behind her came an old man named Namdi who walked slowly with a wooden stick. "Make space," he said loudly. "I must buy pepper today." Two young wives hurried forward with baskets in their hands. "Dorcas, I came early today," one said breathlessly. "I want the biggest ones," the other added quickly. Within moments, Dorcas's table was surrounded by villagers. Women pushing heavy baskets stopped walking and joined the crowd. Old men leaned on their walking sticks and waited patiently. Even some young boys came closer just to stare at the peppers. Dorcas stood behind the table and looked at the crowd with calm eyes. "Please, one by one," she said gently. But the excitement was too much. "Dorcas, give me 5. I want 10 peppers. No, give me the ones at the top." Everyone was talking at the same time. Dorcas laughed softly and raised her hand. "Please, please," she said. "Everyone will get some." The crowd slowly quieted. Dorcas reached into the basket and picked up one of the peppers. It was large, smooth, and deep red like fresh blood. The skin of the pepper shone brightly under the sunlight. The woman with the baby on her back leaned forward with wide eyes. "Ah, look at that pepper," she said in amazement. Dorcas placed several peppers into the woman's basket. "Take these," she said. The woman smiled happily. "My soup will smell wonderful tonight," she said before hurrying away. Next came the old man, Namdi. Dorcas greeted him politely. "Good morning, Namdi." "Good morning, Dorcas," he replied. He picked up one pepper and examined it closely. He said thoughtfully. He turned the pepper slowly in his hand. "I have lived in this village for many years, but I have never seen pepper this fresh every single day." Dorcas simply smiled. "Fresh pepper makes good soup," she said calmly. Namdi chuckled and bought several peppers before walking away. More customers stepped forward. Each time Dorcas reached into the basket, she pulled out peppers that looked perfect, smooth, bright red, and firm. Soon the basket began to look slightly less full, but the crowd did not reduce. Instead, more people kept arriving. Across the market, 2 women sat behind their own pepper stores watching everything with angry eyes. One of them was Mama Nkechi, a heavy woman with a round face. The other was tall, thin Mama Adaeze, whose long neck made her look even taller than she already was. In front of them lay their own baskets of pepper, but their peppers were smaller. Some were dull red, some had small wrinkles on the skin. Mama Nkechi folded her arms across her chest and frowned. "Look at that crowd," she muttered. Mama Adaeze clicked her tongue. Mama Nkechi leaned closer. "They are behaving as if Dorcas is the only person selling pepper in this market." Mama Adaeze nodded slowly. "Yes, they don't even look at our table anymore." Mama Nkechi picked up one of her peppers and turned it in her hand. "This pepper came from my farm yesterday. It is good pepper." Mama Adaeze sighed. "Yes, it is good pepper." They both looked again at the crowd around Dorcas' stall. People were laughing and talking happily as they bought peppers. Mama Nkechi shook her head. "I don't understand it." Mama Adaeze narrowed her eyes. "There is something strange about that woman," she said quietly. Mama Nkechi looked at her. "What do you mean?" Mama Adaeze leaned closer so others would not hear. "No farm in this village produces pepper like that every single day." Mama Nkechi nodded slowly. "That is true." Mama Adaeze continued speaking softly. "Even if someone has a big farm, there are days when the harvest is small." Mama Nkechi frowned. "But Dorcas always arrives with a full basket." Mama Adaeze nodded again. "Every single day." Mama Nkechi tapped her fingers on the table. "And the peppers always look perfect." Mama Adaeze whispered carefully. "That is why I think she is using something." Mama Nkechi raised an eyebrow. "Something like what?" Mama Adaeze did not answer immediately. She simply looked again at Dorcas. Meanwhile, Dorcas continued selling her peppers with patience and calm. A young man named Mecca approached the table carrying a cloth bag. "Dorcas," he said with a grin. Dorcas looked up. "Ah, Mecca, you must save some good ones for my mother," Mecca said quickly. Dorcas picked several peppers from the basket and placed them in his bag. "Your mother always cooks good soup," Mecca laughed. "She says your pepper makes it better." Another woman named Chinyere stepped forward. She held one pepper close to her nose and smelled it. Ah, she exclaimed. The smell is already strong. Dorcas smiled. When you cook with it, your neighbors will know. Chinyere laughed loudly. Last week, my husband finished the whole pot of soup because of your pepper. Dorcas chuckled. That means the pepper did its work. The crowd continued laughing and buying. Meanwhile, Mama Nkechi and Mama Adaize watched everything with growing anger. Mama Nkechi leaned closer again. Look at how they are praising her. Mama Adaize's face tightened. Yes. Mama Nkechi lowered her voice even more. I am telling you, something about Dorcas is not normal. Mama Adaize slowly nodded. Yes. They both sat silently for a moment, staring at the busy crowd around Dorcas' stall. Across the market, Dorcas reached into the basket again. There were still many peppers left, but the number was slowly reducing. A small boy who had been watching quietly tugged his mother's wrapper. Mother, he whispered, can we buy from Dorcas too? His mother smiled. Yes. They stepped closer to the table. Dorcas picked 2 of the largest peppers and handed them to the woman. The boy stared at them with wide eyes. They are so big, he said softly. Dorcas smiled kindly. Pepper must be strong. The woman paid and walked away. More customers came. More peppers disappeared into bags and baskets. But the excitement around Dorcas' table never reduced. From a distance, Mama Nkechi and Mama Adaize continued watching, whispering quietly to each other, while their own peppers sat almost untouched. And as the sun climbed higher above the lively market of Atani, Dorcas calmly continued selling her famous red peppers, smiling at her customers, while the whispers of curiosity and jealousy slowly began spreading through the market like smoke. The sun was already leaning toward the afternoon when the market in Atani began to slow down. The loud noise of buyers and sellers slowly became softer. Some traders started packing their goods. Women tied their wrappers tightly as they prepared to walk home. Children ran around the open spaces of the market playing games with sticks and empty baskets. But one place in the market was still lively, Dorcas's table. Even though most of the peppers in her basket were already gone, a small group of men still stood around her table talking and laughing. Dorcas wiped her hands on the edge of her wrapper and looked down into her basket. Only a few peppers remained. She nodded slowly to herself. That is enough for today, she said quietly. She began placing the remaining peppers carefully into a small cloth bag so she could take them home. Standing nearby was tall Okeke, the fisherman. Okeke was a tall man with strong arms from pulling fishing nets every day at the river. His shoulders were broad and his voice was loud. Years ago, Okeke used to laugh when Dorcas passed by the village road. He and his friends would sometimes whisper jokes about her. But now, things had changed. Okeke stood beside Dorcas's table with a wide smile on his face. Dorcas, he said cheerfully. Dorcas looked up at him calmly. Yes, Okeke. Okeke pointed at the large basket on the table. Are you finished selling for today? Dorcas nodded. Yes. Okeke clapped his hands once. Good, he said quickly. Then I will help you carry the basket home. Dorcas looked at him with a small smile. You say that every day. Okeke laughed loudly. That is because you refuse every day. Dorcas lifted the basket slightly. I'm used to carrying my basket. Okeke stepped closer and stretched out his arms. But today you should rest your neck. Okeke raised one eyebrow playfully. Okeke, this basket has not broken my neck for many years. Okeke scratched his head and laughed. Well, that is true. Before Dorcas could say anything else, another voice joined them. Dorcas! They both turned. It was Emeka, the carpenter. Emeka walked quickly toward them, carrying a small wooden hammer in his hand. His shirt was dusty from work, and sawdust still clung to his hair. Emeka was known in the village for talking too much. People often called him the loudest mouth in Atani. Dorcas, he said again as he reached the table. Dorcas smiled politely. Good afternoon, Emeka. Emeka looked into the basket. Ah, you sold almost everything again. Dorcas nodded calmly. Yes. Emeka shook his head in amazement. Your pepper is like gold. Okeke laughed loudly. That is true. Emeka leaned closer. My mother said something yesterday. Dorcas was curious. What did she say? Emeka lifted one finger. She said the soup she cooked with your pepper made the whole compound smell sweet. Okeke laughed loudly. That soup smell probably reached the river where I was fishing. Dorcas chuckled softly. Well, pepper must do its work. Emeka suddenly raised 3 fingers proudly. You remember the day I bought 3 baskets of your pepper? Dorcas nodded slowly. Yes. Okeke looked confused. You bought 3 baskets? Emeka puffed his chest. Yes. Okeke laughed loudly. What did you do with all that pepper? Emeka shrugged. I shared some with my mother, some with my sisters, and some I gave to my neighbors. Okeke grinned proudly. You were just trying to impress Dorcas. Emeka laughed loudly. Maybe. Dorcas shook her head gently. You two talk too much. The 3 of them laughed. But across the market, another group of people were not laughing at all.
Near a large grinding stone beside the market road, several young women sat together. The grinding stone was a big flat rock where women usually ground pepper and tomatoes. Today, it had become a place for gossip. 5 women sat around it. Their names were Adaeze, Amaka, Nkem, Ifunanya, and Chiamaka. All of them had been watching Dorcas from a distance. Adaeze crossed her arms angrily. "Look at them again," she said. Amaka frowned. "Those men behave like hungry goats." Nkem rolled her eyes. "They follow Dorcas everywhere." Chiamaka shook her head slowly. "I don't understand it." Ifunanya leaned forward. "Before, those same men used to laugh at Dorcas." Amaka nodded quickly. "Yes, I remember." She pointed toward Dorcas's table. "Now they stand around her like guards." Adaeze spoke bitterly. "Even Okeke follows her home sometimes." Nkem sighed loudly. "It does not make sense." Amaka lowered her voice. "I think Dorcas has done something." The other women turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Chiamaka asked. Amaka leaned closer. "I mean, maybe she has used something to charm those men." Nkem frowned. "You think she bewitched them?" Amaka shrugged. "How else can you explain this?" Adaeze nodded slowly. "It is very strange." Ifunanya looked at Dorcas again. "That woman they used to call ugly." Amaka scoffed. "Yes." Nkem sighed. "But now men look at her like she is the most beautiful woman in the village." Adaeze tapped her fingers on the grinding stone. "It is that pepper." Chiamaka looked confused. "The pepper?" Adaeze nodded. "Her pepper made her famous." The women fell silent for a moment. Then Amaka spoke again. "We should try selling pepper too." Nkem laughed. "We already sell pepper." Amaka shook her head. "I mean, we should sell pepper like Dorcas." Chiamaka raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Amaka pointed toward Dorcas's table. "Big baskets, bright peppers." Adaeze nodded slowly. "Yes." Ifunanya sighed. "But our peppers never look like that." Nkem leaned back. "Still, we can try." The women began discussing many ideas. One of them suggested wearing brighter clothes to attract attention. Another suggested bringing their peppers earlier in the morning. They talked and talked, trying to find a way to compete with Dorcas. Meanwhile, Dorcas finished packing her remaining peppers. She lifted the empty basket and placed it gently on her head. Okeke quickly stepped forward again. "Dorcas, please let me carry it today." Dorcas smiled. "Are you still trying?" Okeke laughed. "Yes." Emeka raised his hand. "If she refuses you again, I will try next." Dorcas shook her head and began walking toward the market exit. "You two should go home and rest," she said. Okeke and Emeka walked beside her anyway. Across the market, the women near the grinding stone watched her leave. Amaka folded her arms. Look at them following her again. Adaeze sighed deeply. "No matter what we try, the men still crowd around Dorcas." The other women nodded in frustration. As Dorcas walked slowly out of the market with the evening sun shining on the road ahead, the whispers of jealousy and curiosity among the young women of Atani continued growing quietly behind her. The sun had already begun to soften above the village of Atani when Dorcas arrived at the market the next morning. The market was slowly waking up again. Traders were spreading mats on the ground, baskets were being arranged, and the smell of roasted corn and palm oil floated through the warm air. Dorcas walked to her usual wooden table, carrying her large basket of red tatashe peppers on her head. The peppers looked just as fresh and bright as always. Their smooth skin shone under the morning light like polished stones. As soon as Dorcas placed the basket on the table, another woman quickly appeared beside her. "Dorcas!" the woman called happily. Dorcas turned and smiled. It was Soso. Soso was Dorcas's closest friend in the whole village. She was known everywhere in Atani because of 2 things, her loud laughter and her endless talking. If Soso entered a quiet place, it would not remain quiet for long. Soso was a medium-sized woman with bright eyes and a cheerful face. She always wore colorful wrappers and moved with energy like someone who never grew tired.
Good morning, Dorcas, Soso said, placing her hands on her hips. Good morning, Soso, Dorcas replied calmly. Soso leaned forward and looked inside the basket. Ah, she exclaimed loudly. Look at these peppers again. She picked one up and held it high. This one alone can cook a whole pot of soup. Dorcas laughed softly. Put it down before you scare my customers away. Soso placed the pepper back and began arranging the peppers neatly on the table. She stacked them in beautiful piles, turning them so the brightest sides faced outward. You see, Soso said proudly, when people see them arranged like this, they will rush here. Dorcas smiled. They already rush here. Soso burst into loud laughter. That is true. Soon, customers began arriving. Women came with baskets, men stopped by on their way to work, and children gathered around to stare at the bright peppers. As Dorcas sold the peppers, Soso helped collect money and hand peppers to customers. Careful, oh, Soso shouted jokingly at one woman. Don't take the biggest one without paying. The woman laughed. I will pay. Dorcas watched Soso with quiet amusement. Soso always brought life to the market store. She talked to everyone, joked with customers, and sometimes even sang small songs while arranging the peppers. Later that morning, when the crowd became smaller, Soso wiped her forehead and sat down beside Dorcas. She said. Dorcas looked at her. What is it? Soso leaned closer. Dorcas, I must ask you something again. Dorcas already knew the question. She smiled quietly. What do you want to ask? Soso lowered her voice. Where exactly do these peppers come from? Dorcas laughed gently. You have asked me this many times. Yes, Soso replied quickly, because you never answer. Dorcas picked up a pepper and turned it slowly in her hand. It is just pepper. Soso shook her head. No. She pointed at the basket. This is not ordinary pepper. Dorcas said nothing. Soso continued speaking. Every day your basket is full. Yes. Every day the peppers look perfect. Yes. And nobody in the village has ever seen your farm. Dorcas smiled again but did not answer. Soso leaned even closer. Dorcas, tell me the truth. Where do you get them? Dorcas looked calmly at her friend. Then she said softly, Soso, questions do not need answers. Soso frowned slightly. But I am your friend. Dorcas nodded. Yes, you are. Soso sighed. Then why can't you tell me? Dorcas reached for another pepper and placed it on the table. Because some things are better left alone. Soso crossed her arms. That is not fair. Dorcas smiled kindly. You worry too much. Soso shook her head but did not argue further. She had asked this question many times before, and Dorcas always gave the same quiet answer. Later that afternoon, when the market began closing, Dorcas finished selling most of her peppers. Only a few remained in the basket. Soso helped her pack them carefully. Another good day, Soso said proudly. Yes, Dorcas replied. Soso looked at the basket again. You know, if I had peppers like this, I would be the richest woman in Atani. Dorcas chuckled. Maybe. Soso suddenly stood up. Let me walk with you today, she said. Dorcas immediately shook her head. No. Soso sighed loudly. Again? Dorcas lifted the basket onto her head. You know I prefer walking alone. Soso placed her hands on her waist. Dorcas, we have been friends for years. Yes? And you still refuse to let me walk with you. Dorcas looked at her gently. It is nothing personal. Soso frowned. Then what is it? Dorcas hesitated for a moment. Then she said calmly, I just like quiet when I go home. Soso shook her head slowly. You are a very strange woman. Dorcas smiled. Maybe. Soso walked beside her as they left the market, even though Dorcas had not agreed. They walked along the dusty road for some time. Birds flew across the sky, and goats wandered between the houses. Finally, they reached the road that led toward the far edge of the village. Tall grass could already be seen in the distance. Dorcas stopped walking. Soso looked at her. What now? Dorcas pointed gently. My path is there. Soso knew what that meant. Dorcas lived alone in the small hut near the tall grass at the far end of the village. Nobody ever went with her, not even Soso. Soso sighed. You will not allow me to visit even today? Dorcas shook her head. No. Soso crossed her arms again. Not even for a short time? Dorcas smiled kindly. Not today. Soso looked disappointed. You know I have never seen the inside of your hut. Dorcas adjusted the basket on her head. Maybe one day. Soso raised an eyebrow. You always say that. Dorcas chuckled softly. Well, one day might come. Soso stared at her for a moment. Then she laughed suddenly. You are full of secrets, Dorcas. Dorcas said nothing. Soso waved her hand dramatically. Fine. Go to your mysterious hut. Dorcas laughed quietly. Goodbye, Soso. Goodbye, Soso replied. She stood there watching as Dorcas walked down the narrow path toward the tall grass. Dorcas's figure slowly grew smaller as she walked farther away. Finally, she disappeared completely behind the tall grass and trees. Soso remained standing there for a while. She scratched her head. That woman, she muttered. Then she shook her head and turned back toward the village. Even though Dorcas was her closest friend, Soso still knew very little about her life. And the mystery of Dorcas and her perfect red peppers remained as strong as ever in the quiet village of Atani. The evening sun slowly moved down behind the tall trees around the village of Atani. The heat of the day had faded, and a cool breeze moved gently through the air. The narrow path leading to the village stream was busy as women walked down with buckets, basins, and piles of dirty clothes. The stream was one of the most lively places in the village during the evening. It was not just a place where people washed clothes or fetched water. It was also a place where stories were shared, laughter was heard, and gossip traveled faster than the river itself. Several young women had already gathered there. Some were kneeling beside the water, beating clothes against smooth stones. Others sat on low rocks, scrubbing wrappers with soap. A few younger girls stood ankle-deep in the shallow water, rinsing garments. The sound of splashing water mixed with voices talking loudly. Among the women sitting near the water were Adaeze, Amaka, Nkem, Ifunanya, and Chiamaka. These were the same young women who often sat near the grinding stone in the market, whispering about Dorcas. Adaeze slapped a wet wrapper hard against the stone. Splash! Water sprayed into the air. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. I am telling you, something about Dorcas is not normal. Amaka, who was kneeling beside her, washing a basket of clothes, nodded quickly. That woman is hiding something. Nkem leaned forward, scrubbing his shirt carefully. Everybody in the village knows it now. Ifunaya sighed and dipped a cloth into the water. At first, I thought it was just jealousy, she said. But now I am beginning to wonder. Chiamaka, who had been quiet, looked up. You wonder about what? Ifunaya pointed toward the village path. I wonder where those peppers really come from. Adaze slapped another piece of cloth against the stone. Splash! That is exactly what I have been saying. Amaka looked around to make sure no older women were listening. Then she leaned closer to the group. You know, something strange happened to me last week. The other women immediately turned their attention to her. What happened? Nkem asked quickly. Amaka lowered her voice. I tried following Dorcas one evening. All the women stared at her. You did what? Ifunaya asked in surprise. Amaka nodded slowly. Yes. Chiamaka's eyes widened. Why would you do that? Amaka shrugged. I was curious. Adaze leaned closer eagerly. What happened then? Amaka dipped her hands into the water and began rubbing a cloth slowly as she spoke. It was after market that day. Dorcas was walking home with her empty basket like she always does. The other women listened carefully. I waited until she left the market, Amaka continued. Then I followed her quietly from behind. Nkem raised an eyebrow. Did she see you? Amaka shook her head. No. I stayed far behind. She pointed toward the road. She walked toward the edge of the village where that tall grass grows. The women nodded. Everyone in the village knew Dorcas lived alone in a hut near the tall grass. Amaka continued speaking slowly. I followed her halfway down the path. The other women leaned even closer. And then Adaze asked impatiently. Amaka stopped scrubbing the cloth. Her face became serious. And then she turned around. The group fell silent. Chiamaka frowned. So? Amaka shook her head slowly. You don't understand. She leaned closer and whispered. The way she looked at me. The other women waited. It was like she already knew I was there. Nkem laughed nervously. Maybe she heard your footsteps. Amaka shook her head firmly. No. Her voice dropped even lower. That look, it made my heart jump. Adaze raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Amaka shivered slightly. It was not an ordinary look. The women exchanged glances. Amaka continued. I became afraid. You were afraid of Dorcas? Nkem asked with surprise. Amaka nodded slowly. Yes. She squeezed the cloth tightly in her hands. I ran back to the village. The group stared at her in silence for a moment. Then Adaze spoke. I believe you. Amaka looked relieved. You do? Adaze nodded slowly. Yes. She leaned closer. Because I also saw something strange. The other women turned to her. What did you see? Chiamaka asked. Adaze dropped the cloth she was washing and sat upright. It happened very early one morning. How early? Ifunaya asked. Before sunrise. The women looked surprised. Why were you awake that early? Nkem asked. Adaze shrugged. I woke up to use the toilet. The women laughed quietly. Adaze rolled her eyes. Listen. They became quiet again. When I stepped outside my compound, the sky was still dark. She pointed toward the direction of the market. And then I saw Dorcas. Amaka frowned. You saw her? Adaze nodded. She was already walking toward the market. The women looked confused. What is strange about that? Chiamaka asked. Adaze lifted one finger. She was carrying a full basket of peppers. The group froze. But Ifunaya began slowly. Nobody saw her go to any farm. Adaze nodded. That is exactly the problem. Nkem frowned deeply. You are right. Amaka leaned forward. There's no farm near her hut. Chiamaka whispered quietly. So where did the peppers come from? Nobody answered. The sound of water flowing in the stream filled the silence. Finally, Ifunaya spoke softly. Maybe she has a secret farm somewhere. Adaze shook her head nervously. Even if she had a farm, someone would have seen it by now. Nkem rubbed her chin. That is true. Amaka looked around nervously. What if it is not a farm? The other women stared at her. What do you mean? Chiamaka asked. Amaka lowered her voice. What if Dorcas is using something else? The group fell silent again. Finally, Adaze whispered the word nobody had wanted to say. A charm. The word hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Nkem swallowed. You think she's using a charm to grow those peppers? Amaka nodded slowly. Yes. Ifunaya shook her head nervously. That would explain everything. Chiamaka whispered quietly. No wonder the peppers always look perfect. Adaze spoke again. And no wonder the men suddenly started chasing her. The women exchanged worried looks. Amaka dipped her hand into the water again and began rubbing the cloth slowly as she spoke. Our gossip started as jokes, she said quietly. But now I think there may be truth inside it. The others nodded slowly. As the sun disappeared behind the trees and the evening grew darker around the quiet stream, the whispers about Dorcas grew bigger and more frightening. And without realizing it, the young women of Atani had already begun spreading a rumor that would soon travel through the entire village like wildfire. The sun was already lowering in the sky above the quiet village of Atani when the market began to close for the day. The loud voices of traders slowly faded. Some women tied their wrappers tightly as they lifted baskets onto their heads. Men pushed wooden carts out of the market square. Children chased each other between the empty stalls. Dorcas stood behind her wooden table, arranging the last few red tatashe peppers into a small cloth bag. Like every other day, most of the peppers in her basket were already gone. Customers had rushed to buy them, and once again she had sold almost everything. Beside her stood Soso. Soso wiped sweat from her forehead and stretched her back. Ah, she said loudly. Today was another busy day. Dorcas nodded calmly. Yes. Soso looked inside the basket. Only 3 peppers left. Dorcas picked them up carefully and placed them into the cloth bag. That is enough for today, she said. Soso folded her arms and watched Dorcas quietly. But this time, something was different. For many weeks now, Soso had been asking questions about Dorcas's peppers and her secret life. Dorcas always smiled and changed the subject. She never answered. The mystery had slowly grown inside Soso's mind like a seed. Tonight, that seed had grown into something stronger. Curiosity. Strong curiosity. As Dorcas lifted the empty basket onto her head, Soso suddenly spoke. Dorcas. Dorcas looked at her. Yes? Soso forced a smile. Will you walk with me for a short distance today? Dorcas shook her head gently. You know I prefer walking alone. Soso laughed as if she was joking. I know. Dorcas adjusted the basket on her head. I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, Soso replied. Dorcas turned and began walking away from the market. Soso stood there watching her. The evening light was fading slowly and long shadows stretched across the ground. Soso took a deep breath. Then she whispered to herself, "Tonight I will finally know the truth." She waited until Dorcas had walked far ahead. Then quietly, Soso picked up her own small basket and began walking in the same direction. But she walked slowly, very slowly. She kept her distance. Dorcas walked calmly along the dusty road that led toward the far edge of the village. The basket on her head was empty now, but she still carried it with the same confident posture. The sky had turned orange and purple as the sun prepared to disappear behind the trees. Soso followed quietly from far behind. Her heart was beating faster than usual. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. But she did not stop walking. Soon, Dorcas left the main road and turned toward the lonely path that led to her hut. Tall grass grew on both sides of the narrow path. Old trees stood quietly in the fading light. This part of the village was always quiet. Very few people came here. Soso quickly stepped behind a tree as Dorcas passed. She pressed her back against the rough bark and held her breath. Dorcas walked past slowly without looking back. Soso waited for several seconds. Then she carefully peeked around the tree. Dorcas was already walking deeper into the path. Soso stepped out quietly and continued following. Her footsteps were slow and careful. She avoided stepping on dry leaves that might make noise. The tall grass brushed softly against her legs as she moved. The sky grew darker. Birds flew above the trees as they returned to their nests. Soso's heart continued beating loudly inside her chest. She whispered softly, "Please don't turn around." Ahead of her, Dorcas continued walking calmly, as if she knew nothing. After some time, the small hut finally appeared. Dorcas's hut stood alone near a cluster of old trees. It was simple and small, made from clay walls and a roof of dried palm leaves. Tall grass surrounded the area, and the place looked quiet and lonely. Soso quickly crouched behind another tree before Dorcas reached the hut. She watched carefully. Dorcas walked to the door, lowered the basket from her head, and pushed the wooden door open. Then she stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The small hut became silent. Soso waited. She remained hidden behind the tree. Her breathing was slow and careful. Minutes passed and nothing happened. No sound came from inside the hut. Soso frowned slightly. "That is strange," she whispered. She expected to hear something. Maybe movement, maybe talking, maybe the sound of work. But the hut remained completely quiet. Soso slowly moved closer. She stayed low and careful. The dry grass brushed softly against her legs. She reached another tree that stood closer to the hut. From there, she could see the door clearly. Still nothing. The hut looked dark and silent. Soso's curiosity grew stronger. What is she doing inside? She wondered. She leaned forward slightly. Still no sound. The evening air had become cooler now. Crickets began making soft sounds in the grass. The sky above was slowly turning blue-dark. Soso waited, and waited, and waited. Her legs began to ache from crouching. She shifted her weight quietly. Still nothing. The silence of the hut began to feel strange, almost too strange. Soso felt a small shiver run down her back. "What if she comes out suddenly?" she whispered. She looked around nervously. The tall grass moved gently in the wind. The old trees stood quietly in the darkness. Soso suddenly realized something. She was alone. Very alone. Far from the rest of the village. Her heart began beating faster again. "What if Dorcas sees me here?" she thought. She waited a few more minutes, but the hut remained silent. Finally, Soso slowly stood up. She looked once more at the quiet hut. "I should go," she whispered. She carefully stepped backward away from the tree. Then she turned and began walking quickly back toward the village path. The tall grass brushed against her legs again as she moved faster. Her heart still beat loudly as she hurried away from the lonely place. After some time, the familiar lights of the village houses appeared ahead. Soso slowed down. She looked back once toward the dark path behind her. Dorcas's hut was no longer visible. Soso shook her head slowly. "That woman," she murmured. Then she continued walking home. Even though she had followed Dorcas all the way to her hut, the mystery around Dorcas had not been solved. In fact, it had only grown deeper. Morning returned quietly to the riverside village of Atani. The sky was still pale when the first rooster crowed loudly from behind one of the clay houses. A cool breeze moved gently through the tall palm trees, and smoke from cooking fires slowly rose above the roofs of the compounds. Women stepped outside their homes with brooms made from palm fronds and began sweeping their yards. The soft sound of sweeping dust across the ground filled the air. Goats wandered slowly between houses looking for food, and children who had just woken up rubbed sleep from their eyes. Soon, the narrow paths of the village began filling with people heading toward the market. Among those people was Soso. But this morning, Soso did not walk with her usual loud laughter. She walked slowly, her face serious, her mind busy with thoughts. The memory of the previous night was still clear in her head. She had followed Dorcas all the way to her hut. She had hidden behind trees. She had waited outside the hut for a long time, yet nothing had happened. Dorcas had entered the hut and closed the door, and the place remained silent the whole time. Soso had gone home confused. Now she was walking to the market with many questions in her mind. What exactly is Dorcas hiding, she wondered. The morning sun slowly rose higher as Soso reached the busy market square. Traders were already setting up their stalls. Mats were spread on the ground. Baskets of vegetables were arranged neatly in rows. The smell of roasted corn and fresh fish filled the air. Soso walked straight toward the wooden table where Dorcas usually sold her peppers. But Dorcas had not arrived yet. Soso folded her arms and waited. People passed by greeting her. "Good morning, Soso," one woman said. "Good morning," Soso replied quietly. Normally, Soso would have joked and laughed with everyone, but today she was distracted. She kept looking toward the road that led into the market. After a few minutes, someone shouted from the entrance of the market, "Dorcas is coming!" Soso quickly turned her head. There she was. Dorcas walked calmly toward the market with her usual slow, confident steps. The large basket rested on her head just as it did every day. But it was what was inside the basket that made Soso's eyes widen. Bright red peppers. Many of them. The basket was completely full. The peppers looked smooth, fresh, and shining under the morning sunlight like red jewels. Soso stared in disbelief. Her heart began beating faster. "That is impossible," she whispered to herself. She knew something others did not know. Dorcas had not left her hut the night before. Soso had watched the hut. Dorcas had entered the hut and stayed there. So where had the peppers come from? Dorcas reached the wooden table and slowly lowered the basket onto it. "Good morning, Soso," she said calmly. Soso blinked several times. Good morning," she replied. Dorcas began arranging the peppers on the table as she always did. She picked them one by one, placing them neatly in bright red piles. Soon the peppers covered the table beautifully. Soso walked closer and picked one up. She turned it slowly in her hand. The pepper was perfect, smooth, bright, fresh. It looked even better than the peppers Dorcas had sold the previous day. Soso frowned. "How?" she murmured. Dorcas glanced at her. "What did you say?" Soso quickly placed the pepper back. Nothing, but she could not hide her confusion on her face. Dorcas continued arranging the peppers calmly. Soon customers began gathering around the table. "Dorcas, save some for me. I came early today. Give me the biggest ones." Dorcas greeted them warmly. "Yes, one moment." She began selling the peppers as usual. Women with baskets stepped forward eagerly. Men carrying bags waited patiently in line. The peppers began disappearing quickly into customers' baskets. But Soso stood beside the table, watching everything with deep curiosity. Finally, she leaned closer to Dorcas. "Dorcas," she whispered. Dorcas looked at her while handing peppers to a customer. "Yes?" Soso waited until the customer left. Then she spoke again. "Where did these peppers come from?" Dorcas smiled. "From my basket." Soso shook her head impatiently. "You know what I mean." Dorcas chuckled softly. Soso lowered her voice. "I followed you last night." Dorcas stopped arranging peppers for a moment. She slowly turned to look at Soso. "You followed me?" Soso nodded. "Yes." Dorcas's expression remained calm. "You should not do that." Soso crossed her arms. "I waited outside your hut for a long time." Dorcas said nothing. Soso pointed at the basket. "You did not go to any farm." Dorcas quietly continued arranging the peppers. "And yet," Soso continued, "this morning you arrived with a full basket again." Dorcas finally looked directly at her friend. There was a small smile on her face. "Soso," she said gently. "Yes?" "My dear friend." Soso leaned closer. "Yes?" Dorcas laughed softly. "Some things are better left as secrets." Soso stared in disbelief. That is your answer? Dorcas nodded calmly. Yes. Soso threw her hands in the air. Dorcas! Customers nearby began laughing at Soso's dramatic reaction. Dorcas continued selling peppers peacefully. Soso sighed deeply. You are the most mysterious woman in this village. Dorcas smiled. Maybe. Soso looked again at the bright red peppers shining on the table. Her curiosity had not disappeared. In fact, it had grown even stronger. And as the busy morning continued in the lively market of Atani, Soso realized that the mystery of Dorcas and her perfect red peppers was far from being solved. By the time another market week had passed in Atani, Dorcas was no longer just a woman who sold pepper. She had become the biggest talk in the whole village. Her name moved from one compound to another faster than smoke from a cooking fire. People talked about her at the stream, at the market, near the grinding stone, outside the church, and even under the moon when families sat outside their huts to catch cool air. No matter where people gathered, somebody would always lower a voice and say, "What do you really think about Dorcas?" Then every ear would open, every neck would turn, and the talking would begin again. It was not only because her peppers were fresh, it was because nobody could explain her. Dorcas kept walking through the village with that same proud, calm way she always had, carrying her basket full of red tatashe like a queen who feared nobody. She did not answer useless questions. She did not beg people to buy from her. She did not run after anybody. She simply came, sold, smiled when she wanted, and went back to her lonely hut near the tall grass. That quiet confidence troubled many people, more than if she had shouted or argued. Silence made her bigger. Mystery made her stronger. Because of that, the whole village began watching her closely. In the market, eyes followed Dorcas even when people pretended not to be looking. If she bent to arrange her peppers, somebody noticed. If she laughed, somebody remembered it. If she refused the man's gift, 10 people talked about it before sunset. It was as if the village had decided that Dorcas was no longer allowed to be just a pepper seller. Every move she made now carried meaning. The women who hated her the most were the market women whose own peppers sat on their tables, growing soft under the sun, while Dorcas sold out before noon. Among them, Mama Adaize and Mama Nkechi remained the loudest in jealousy, though they were careful not to show it openly before customers. They had grown tired of watching people pass their stalls and rush straight to Dorcas, as if the rest of the market did not matter. One morning, before many customers arrived, Mama Adaize sat on her low stool behind her table, fanning herself with a flat piece of carton. Her long neck moved forward sharply each time she spoke. Beside her sat Mama Nkechi, who had spread out her own peppers carefully, but even she knew they looked weak beside Dorcas's bright red ones. Mama Adaize clicked her tongue and stared across the market. "There she is again," she said. Mama Nkechi looked up. Dorcas had just arrived and was lowering her basket onto her wooden table. The peppers inside looked so fresh that even from a distance they seemed to shine. Mama Nkechi's face tightened. "Every day," she muttered. "Every single day." A third seller named Ebere, who sold tomatoes and onions nearby, leaned closer and whispered, "I am tired of this matter. The whole market now behaves as if Dorcas is feeding the entire village alone." Mama Adaize waved her hand in irritation. "Because people are foolish." Mama Nkechi shook her head slowly. "No, people are greedy. They see big pepper, they forget their sense." Ebere gave a slow laugh. "That may be true, but even I must admit, her pepper does look too fine." Mama Adaize turned sharply. "Too fine, exactly. That is the problem. It is too fine." She leaned forward on her stool and lowered her voice. "I have been thinking." Mama Nkechi looked at her. "About what?" Mama Adaize's eyes narrowed. "About where she gets them." Ebere stopped arranging her tomatoes. "You have found out something." Mama Adaize sat up with importance. "Not yet, but I believe Dorcas is stealing pepper from another village at night." Mama Nkechi blinked. "Stealing?" "Yes," Mama Adaize said firmly. "Think about it. Maybe there is some village far from here where farmers harvest good pepper, and in the dark of night, Dorcas goes there, takes what is not hers, and brings it here before morning." Ebere frowned. But carrying so much pepper from another village every day, alone? Mama Adaeze lifted her shoulders. Who knows how she does it? Maybe she has people helping her. Mama Nkechi was not convinced. She folded her arms across her chest and shook her head. No, I do not believe that one. Mama Adaeze frowned at her. Why? Mama Nkechi pointed towards Dorcas' store. Because if she was stealing from another village, by now those people would have come here shouting. Have you heard anybody from another village come to complain? No? Ebere nodded. That is true. Mama Nkechi lowered her voice and spoke with slow seriousness. I believe Dorcas has a secret farm deep inside the forest. Ebere's mouth fell open a little. Deep inside the forest? Yes, Mama Nkechi said. Somewhere nobody can see. Somewhere hidden. That is why nobody knows where she goes. Mama Adaeze laughed dryly. And she farms alone? Mama Nkechi lifted her chin. Why not? Strange women do strange things. Ebere looked from one woman to the other. If it is true, then how does she carry so much pepper every day? Mama Nkechi answered quickly. That is why it is secret. Maybe the farm is not ordinary. The three women fell silent for a moment, each one holding tightly to her own suspicion. Across the market, Dorcas was arranging her peppers in neat piles while customers already gathering. As always, her face was calm. She did not look left or right to see who was talking about her. She acted as if the whole market was just wind passing by. That only made the jealous women more annoyed. Mama Adaeze hissed under her breath. See her. She stands there like a chief's wife. Mama Nkechi replied, the day we expose her, she will know that this market does not belong to her. The word expose sat heavily between them. It made Ebere lean in closer. What are you planning? Mama Adaeze looked around carefully before speaking. We watch, we listen, we follow if we must. One day she will make a mistake. Mama Nkechi nodded. Yes, nobody hides forever. They all looked towards Dorcas again. At that same time, Dorcas was handing peppers to a woman named BC, who smiled with delight. Dorcas, BC said, your pepper made my stew so sweet yesterday that my children licked their fingers. Dorcas smiled slightly. Then buy enough for today. BC laughed and paid her quickly. Standing nearby, as usual, were men who had found one excuse or another to remain close to Dorcas's table. Some pretended they were waiting to buy. Some had already bought but did not leave. Some simply enjoyed hearing her talk. Tall Okeke the fisherman stood there with his fishing net hanging over one shoulder. His eyes kept moving from the peppers to Dorcas's face. Beside him stood Emeka the carpenter, smiling too much and trying to speak louder than everybody else. Emeka lifted one pepper and whistled. Ah, Dorcas, this one is so fresh that if I keep it in my room, I may start dreaming of soup. The people around laughed. Dorcas took the pepper from him and placed it back. Then buy it and dream in peace. The crowd laughed again. Okeke stepped closer. Dorcas, have you eaten this morning? Dorcas looked at him calmly. Yes. Okeke nodded too quickly. Good, that is good. Emeka nudged him with his elbow. What kind of question is that? Okeke frowned. I was only asking. Emeka turned to Dorcas. Ignore him. He does not know how to speak to a woman. Dorcas shook her head with a small smile. Both of you talk too much. The men around laughed again, but none of them seemed offended. In fact, they looked pleased that Dorcas had spoken to them at all. From her stall, Mama Adaeze watched them with disgust. Hungry goats, she muttered. Mama Nkechi spat to the side. All of them. It was true. The men continued chasing Dorcas with gifts and sweet words, and the more she refused them, the more interested they became. Some brought her roasted groundnuts, some offered to help carry her basket. Some praised her pepper, as if praising the pepper would somehow open Dorcas's heart. Yet, Dorcas accepted very little from anyone. She thanked people politely, but she kept her distance. That also made the men chase her more. People always want what they cannot easily get. One afternoon, when the market was nearly closing and most traders were packing up, Okeke arrived carrying a rolled bundle of fresh raffia and a few pieces of wood. His face shone with the importance of a man who had prepared a clever plan. He walked straight to Dorcas's stall. Dorcas, he said proudly, Dorcas looked up from tying her cloth bag. Okeke? He dropped the bundle gently on the ground. I have brought something. Dorcas looked at the raffia and wood. For what? Okeke smiled, showing all his teeth. For your roof. Dorcas paused. My roof? Yes, Okeke said quickly. I passed near your place some days ago and noticed the roof may soon need repair. Rainy season will come before we know it. I am a good man, Dorcas. I do not want rain to disturb you. Dorcas looked at him quietly. She understood at once. This was not really about the roof. Emeka, who happened to be nearby, burst into laughter. So this is your new trick? Okeke waved him away. Leave me. Emeka laughed harder. You want to see inside Dorcas's hut with your own eyes. Some people nearby turned to look. A few women began smiling. The market loved nothing more than a public moment. Okeke straightened his shoulders. What is wrong if I help? A man can help a woman. Dorcas remained calm. Who told you my roof needs repair? Okeke hesitated. Well, nobody told me. I just thought... Dorcas finished the sentence for him. You just thought it would be a good excuse to visit my home. The people nearby laughed openly now. Okeke's ears grew hot with embarrassment, but he still tried to smile. I only wanted to help, he said. Dorcas's face softened a little, but her voice remained firm. Thank you, Okeke, but I prefer living quietly by myself. Okeke blinked. So you do not need the help? Dorcas held her head. No. I can do it quickly before sunset. No. I will not disturb you. Dorcas lifted her bag. I said no. Her voice was not rude, but it was final. Okeke stood still for a moment, holding his bundle of raffia and wood, while the people around watched with interest. Emeka could not stop laughing. Dorcas has sent you back to the river. Okeke glared at him. Mind your mouth. But Dorcas did not stay to watch the embarrassment grow. She adjusted her basket, lifted it to her head, and prepared to leave. Before turning away, she said quietly, Okeke, not every door is meant to be opened. Then she began walking out of the market. The sentence settled over the people nearby like dust after a sudden wind. Some smiled, some frowned, some looked even more curious than before. Okeke remained standing there, still holding the raffia and wood, while Emeka shook his head in amusement. She has not even allowed you to reach the path. Okeke sighed deeply. That woman is different. Ebere, who had heard the whole exchange from nearby, quickly hurried to Mama Nkechi and Mama Adiasi. Did you hear? She whispered. Mama Adiasi lifted her head. What now? Ebere, Okeke offered to repair Dorcas's hot roof and she refused him in front of everybody. Mama Nkechi's eyes widened with interest. She refused. Ebere nodded. She said she prefers living quietly by herself. Mama Adiasi gave a slow smile, but it was not a friendly one. Good. Good? Ebere asked. Mama Adiasi leaned closer. The more she refuses people, the more suspicious she becomes. Mama Nkechi nodded eagerly. Yes, a person with nothing to hide does not guard a hut like that. Ebere glanced toward the road where Dorcas had gone. The village will talk about this before night. And let them talk, Mama Adiasi said. Every whisper brings us closer to the truth. By sunset, the story had indeed reached many compounds. Women cooking outside their homes mentioned it between stirring soup and blowing fire. Men returning from the river spoke of it while washing their feet. Children repeated broken pieces of the story without fully understanding it. Dorcas refused Okeke. She said nobody should come to her hut. She is hiding something. At one compound, an elderly woman named Mama Uju sat on a low stool, cracking palm kernels while two younger women spoke nearby. One of the younger women said, "Why would anybody refuse free help?" Mama Uju did not look up from her walk. Because not every help is help. The second woman frowned. What does that mean? Mama Uju dropped a kernel shell into a bowl and replied, Sometimes people come with a gift in their hands and questions in their eyes. The younger women looked at each other quietly. Even Soso had the story before the evening was over. She was returning from the stream when she met a girl who said breathlessly, "Did you hear what happened in the market? Okeke wanted to repair Dorcas's roof, but she sent him away. Soso only nodded. Yes, that sounds like Dorcas. The girl lowered her voice. Why does she never allow anybody near her home? Soso was silent for a moment. She thought of the night she had secretly followed Dorcas and hid him behind a tree, waiting for something, anything to happen. She still had no answer. Finally, she said, that is the same question everybody is asking. As darkness settled over Atani and lamps began glowing softly inside huts, the mystery around Dorcas did not reduce. It grew stronger. The jealous market women became more determined. The men became more curious. The whispers became more daring. And Dorcas, without changing her ways at all, became even harder for the village to understand. She had refused Okeke politely, but that refusal did more than protect the privacy of her hut. It fed the hunger of the whole village. Now, even more people wanted to know what kind of woman lived alone near the tall grass, sold the finest pepper anyone had ever seen, allowed nobody into her home, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of a person who knew a secret no one else could touch. The night came quietly over the village of Atani, but it did not remain quiet for long. Dark clouds gathered slowly in the sky, covering the moon and stars until the whole village lay under a heavy blanket of darkness. The air became thick and still, and people sitting outside their homes began looking up at the sky with worry. Old Mama Ujunu, who always noticed signs in the weather, shook her head slowly as she sat on a small wooden stool outside her hut. "Rain is coming," she muttered. A moment later, a loud rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Boom! Children who were still playing outside quickly ran toward their houses. Another flash of lightning cut across the dark clouds. Then the rain began. At first, it was only a few drops. Plop, plop, plop. But within seconds, the rain grew heavier, falling hard on the roofs of the houses. The sound of water hitting the zinc roofs echoed loudly across the village. Soon, the narrow roads became muddy streams. Most people stayed inside their homes, sitting near small lamps while the rain poured outside. But far away from the center of the village, near the riverbank, a young boy named Chidi was still outside. Chidi was about 10 years old. He was a thin boy with quick eyes and restless energy. Earlier that evening, he had been helping his uncle, a fisherman named Obina, repair a fishing net near the river. They had stayed longer than they planned because the net had several tears. Now the storm had caught them before they could finish their work. Obina quickly tied the rope around the repaired net and shouted over the noise of the rain. "Chidi!" The boy turned toward him. "Yes, uncle. Run home before the rain gets worse." Chidi nodded. "Okay." He quickly grabbed a small basket his uncle had given him earlier and began running along the narrow path that led from the river toward the village. The rain fell heavily around him, soaking his clothes almost immediately. The muddy path made his feet slip, but Chidi kept running as fast as he could. Thunder cracked again across the sky. Boom! Lightning flashed, lighting up the tall grass and trees for a moment before everything became dark again. Chidi ran faster. "I must reach home before the road floods," he muttered to himself. The path he followed passed near the lonely part of the village where very few people lived. Tall grass grew thick along both sides of the road, and old trees leaned quietly over the path. Somewhere ahead stood Dorcas's hut. Most children in the village avoided passing near that place at night, but Chidi had no choice. The rain grew even heavier. Water splashed under his feet as he ran. Then suddenly, something caught his eye. A strange light. Chidi slowed. Through the rain and darkness, he could see a faint red glow shining from the direction of Dorcas's hut. He stopped running. "What is that?" he whispered. The red glow flickered gently, shining through the small window of the hut. Chidi wiped rain from his face and squinted. The light looked unusual. It was not the soft yellow light of a normal oil lamp. It was red, deep red, like burning pepper. Curiosity began to grow inside him. He took a few careful steps closer. The rain continued pouring down around him, but Chidi barely noticed now. His eyes were fixed on the strange light. He walked slowly toward the hut. The closer he came, the brighter the red glow appeared. His heart began beating faster. What is Dorcas doing inside? He wondered. Most nights, her hut looked completely dark and quiet, but tonight, something was different. Chidi reached the wall of the hut and crouched down beside it. The clay walls were wet from the rain, and water dripped from the roof above. He moved slowly along the side of the hut until he reached the small window. The window was closed with wooden boards, but there were small cracks between the boards where light could pass through. The red glow inside shone clearly through those cracks. Chidi swallowed nervously. He knew he should leave, but curiosity pushed him forward. Slowly, carefully, he leaned closer. He placed one eye near one of the small cracks in the wood. Then he looked inside. At first, he could not understand what he was seeing. The inside of the hut looked very simple. There was a wooden bed against one wall. A small table stood in the corner, but in the middle of the room stood something strange, a large clay pot. It was bigger than any cooking pot Chidi had ever seen. The pot sat directly on the floor, and beside it stood Dorcas. Chidi's eyes widened. Dorcas was standing beside the pot, holding a single red pepper in her hand. Her face looked serious and focused. The red glow inside the room seemed to come from the pot itself. Chidi leaned closer to see better. "What is she doing?" he whispered. Inside the hut, Dorcas slowly lifted the pepper in her hand. She looked down at the pot. Then she spoke softly, though Chidi could not hear the exact words through the rain. Dorcas dropped the single pepper into the clay pot. The moment the pepper touched the bottom of the pot, something unbelievable happened. Chidi's mouth fell open. Inside the pot, more peppers suddenly appeared. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, dozens. The pot began filling up with bright red peppers as if they were growing out of thin air. They appeared one after the other, piling up quickly inside the pot. The red glow grew brighter as the peppers multiplied. Chidi blinked rapidly. He rubbed his eyes, but the scene did not change. The peppers kept appearing, more and more of them. Soon, the pot was full, but the peppers did not stop. They continued appearing until they began spilling over the sides of the pot onto the floor. Chidi's heart pounded loudly inside his chest. "What is this?" he whispered in shock. Inside the hut, Dorcas calmly picked up the peppers that had fallen onto the floor and placed them neatly into her large market basket. Her face showed no surprise at all. It was as if this strange miracle was something she had done many times before. Chidi could hardly breathe. He had never seen anything like this in his life. The rain continued falling heavily outside, but Chidi remained frozen beside the wall of the hut. He watched as Dorcas repeated the process. She picked up another single pepper, dropped it into the pot, and once again, the pot filled with dozens of fresh red peppers appearing out of nowhere. Chidi felt a chill run down his back. "This is magic," he whispered. His mind struggled to understand what he was seeing. Now he finally understood why Dorcas always arrived at the market with a full basket. The answer was right in front of him. The clay pot. The magical peppers. Chidi slowly leaned back from the window crack. His legs felt weak. He stood quietly in the rain, breathing heavily. The secret of Dorcas had just been revealed. But the boy knew something else too. This was not a secret he could keep to himself. Someone in the village had to know what he had just seen. The rain had stopped by the time morning came to the quiet village of Atani, but the ground was still wet and muddy. Water dripped slowly from the leaves of the tall trees, and the air felt fresh and cool after the long stormy night. Inside a small compound near the river, a young boy named Chidi sat quietly on a wooden bench.
His eyes looked tired because he had hardly slept. Across from him stood his uncle, Obina. Obina was a tall fisherman with strong hands and a serious face. He had been listening carefully as Chidi repeated the strange story again and again. "Uncle," said Chidi nervously, "I am telling the truth." Obina folded his arms across his chest. "Are you sure you did not imagine it?" Chidi shook his head quickly. "No, I saw it with my own eyes." He leaned forward. "There was a big clay pot inside Dorcas's hut." Obina did not interrupt him. "And when she dropped one pepper inside, many more peppers appeared." He spread his hands wide. "So many peppers." Obina remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "This matter is not something children should be joking about." "I am not joking," Chidi insisted. Obina rubbed his chin slowly. The boy looked serious, very serious. Obina had known Chidi since the day he was born. The boy sometimes played tricks, but he was not a liar. Still, the story sounded impossible. A clay pot that produced endless peppers? Obina walked slowly across the yard and sat down on another bench. "Tell me again," he said quietly. Chidi nodded eagerly. He described everything carefully. The heavy rain, the red glow shining from Dorcas's hut, the clay pot inside the room. The moment Dorcas dropped a single pepper inside, and the unbelievable sight of dozens of fresh peppers appearing inside the pot, Obina listened to every word. When Chidi finished speaking, the yard became quiet. Only the sound of dripping water could be heard. Finally, Obina stood up. "If what you saw is true," he said slowly, "then this matter is bigger than both of us." Chidi looked worried. "What will we do?" Obina looked toward the road leading to the center of the village. "We will speak to the elders." That evening, as the sun began to set, Obina quietly walked toward the meeting place of the elders. He did not shout the story across the village. He did not spread the rumor among the young men. Instead, he chose to speak only to a few trusted elders. These were men who had lived in the village for many years and were respected for their wisdom. The elders sat under a large tree near the center of the village. Their names were Elder Nandi, Elder Okafor, Elder Chuku, and Elder Obi. They were discussing ordinary village matters when Obina arrived. "Good evening," Obina said respectfully. The elders nodded. "Good evening, Obina." Elder Nandi looked at him closely. "You look troubled." Obina sat down slowly. "There is something important I must tell you." The elders exchanged curious glances. "What is it?" Elder Okafor asked. Obina took a deep breath. "It is about Dorcas." The moment he mentioned her name, the elders leaned forward. Everyone in the village knew about Dorcas and her mysterious peppers. Obina spoke quietly but clearly. "My nephew saw something last night." The elders listened carefully as Obina repeated Chidi's story. At first, they frowned. Elder Chuku shook his head. "A clay pot producing endless peppers? That cannot be true," Elder Obi said. But Obina raised his hand. "That is why I brought the boy." He turned toward the edge of the compound. "Chidi, come." The boy stepped forward slowly. The elders looked at him. Elder Nandi spoke gently. "Boy, tell us exactly what you saw." Chidi swallowed nervously, but began explaining everything again. He described the storm, the red light, the clay pot. The moment the peppers appeared, he spoke carefully and confidently. When he finished, the elders sat in silence. Finally, Elder Okafor spoke. "This story is too detailed to be a simple lie." Elder Chuku nodded slowly. "Yes." Elder Obi rubbed his beard. "If this is true, then something unusual is happening in that hut." Elder Nandi stood up slowly. "We must confirm the truth." Obina looked at him. "How?" Elder Nandi's voice became firm. "We go there tonight." The others nodded. "But quietly," Elder Chuku added. "We do not want panic in the village." Everyone agreed. Later that night, the village of Atani fell into deep silence. Most people were already asleep inside their homes.
The moon hung high in the sky, shining softly over the tall grass and narrow paths. 5 men moved quietly along one of those paths: Obina, Chidi, and the 4 elders. Each elder carried a small lantern. The light flickered gently as they walked. The group moved carefully through the tall grass near the edge of the village. Nobody spoke loudly. Finally, they reached the area where Dorcas's hut stood. Chidi pointed. "Quietly. There." The elders looked ahead. A faint red glow shone from the small window of the hut, exactly as the boy had described. Elder Nandi frowned. "What do you see?" Obina whispered. The elders exchanged serious looks. Slowly, they walked closer. The lantern swung softly in their hands. When they reached the wall of the hut, Elder Okafor carefully looked through the small window. His eyes widened. "What do you see?" Obina whispered. Elder Okafor stepped back slowly. "She's inside." The others quickly looked through the crack. Inside the hut, Dorcas stood beside a large clay pot, the same pot Chidi had described. She held a single red pepper in her hand. The red glow filled the room. The elders watched in silence. Dorcas dropped the pepper into the pot. Suddenly, the pot began filling with fresh peppers, dozens of them, appearing one after another, exactly as Chidi had said. Elder Obi gasped. "This is not possible." Elder Chuku shook his head in shock. "This is real." The elders stepped back from the window. Elder Nandi took a deep breath. "We must confront her." He walked to the door. The others followed behind him. Slowly, carefully, Elder Nandi pushed the door open. The wooden door creaked loudly. Inside the hut, Dorcas froze. Her eyes widened as she saw the men standing in the doorway. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Elder Nandi stepped forward. "Dorcas." His voice echoed inside the small room. "What is this?" The clay pot continued glowing red. Peppers still filled the pot. Elder Okafor raised his lantern. "Explain yourself." Dorcas looked from one face to another. She looked shocked. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then the red glow inside the room suddenly became brighter, much brighter. The lantern flames began shaking wildly. The air inside the hut seemed to move strangely. Elder Obi stepped back nervously. "What is happening?" Dorcas still stood beside the pot. Her eyes were wide. Then something unbelievable happened. Before anyone could move, Dorcas vanished. Just like smoke blown away by wind, she disappeared completely. The elders shouted in shock. "What?" Obina rushed forward. "Where did she go?" The clay pot suddenly fell to the floor. Crash! It broke into several pieces. The red glow disappeared instantly. The room became dark. The elders looked around frantically. "Dorcas! Dorcas!" They searched the hut. They looked behind the bed, under the table, near the broken pot, but Dorcas was gone. They rushed outside. The tall grass moved gently in the night wind. The moon shone quietly above, but Dorcas was nowhere to be seen. The elders searched the bushes. They searched the narrow path. They even checked the forest edge, but Dorcas had vanished completely. By morning, the story had spread through the entire village. People gathered in small groups discussing the strange event. Some looked frightened. Some looked amazed. Mama Ntechi whispered loudly to her neighbors, "I always knew that woman was not ordinary." Mama Adaizin nodded quickly. Yes. Others spoke more softly. Maybe Dorcas was using powerful magic. Maybe the clay pot was the source of her endless peppers. But some people believed something else. Old Mama Uje shook her head slowly. "That woman was never normal," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" someone asked. Mama Uju looked toward the road leading to the market. "Sometimes spirits walk among us without anyone knowing." A shiver passed through the crowd. From that day forward, Dorcas was never seen again in Atani village. Her hut remained empty, the clay pot was gone, and the famous basket of peppers never returned to the market. Yet, sometimes very early in the morning, when the market women arranged their vegetables under the rising sun, someone would quietly whisper, "If you ever see peppers that are too red, too big, and too fresh," they would look around nervously. It might mean Dorcas has come back. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the village, people wondered if the mysterious pepper seller was still watching them from the shadows. My people, what do you think really happened to Dorcas that night? Did she truly disappear like a spirit, or was she something else all along? Was Dorcas a ghost that came to live quietly among the people of Atani, or was the clay pot hiding a deeper secret nobody understood? Tell me, my people, if you were one of the elders that night and saw Dorcas vanish with your own eyes, what would you believe? Write your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what my people think. Thank you for watching this story on AfroTales TV. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and share with friends and family. We have more beautiful stories coming your way, so subscribe and stay tuned. See you in the next one.